on a crystalline morning at 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. Major Hans Kogler's oxygen mask had frozen against his face as he led his mixed formation of fighters toward what ground controllers promised would be unescorted bombers deep within the Reich. The date was March 6, 1904. And what Kogler witnessed through his Messerschmitt Bf-109G6 canopy would shatter every assumption the Luftwaffe had built since America's daylight bombing campaign began. Actung, Indiana at 12 o'clock high. Single-engine fighters with drop tanks crackled through his headset with growing panic. Kogler's blood turned to ice water as he watched the glinting silver shapes grow larger, their distinctive squared wingtips and sleek profiles becoming unmistakable. These were North American P-51 Mustangs, moving through the sky with the easy confidence of predators who knew they had fuel to burn, altitude to spare, and all the time in the world to hunt. The impossible had become reality. American single-engine fighters were escorting 730 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force not just toward Berlin, but all the way there and all the way back. For the first time in aerial warfare history, no sanctuary remained beyond enemy reach. This moment would trigger the most profound psychological collapse in military aviation history. Not merely the destruction of aircraft and pilots, but the complete annihilation of the belief system that had sustained German air superiority since 1939. The mathematics of defeat were being written not in conference rooms, but in contrails streaking across Brandenburg's sky. The shock had been building for weeks, though few in Luftwaffe High Command had connected the dots. On January 11, 1944, Major Hermann Graf commanding JG-11 had encountered American single-engine fighters near Brunswick, 150 miles deeper into Germany than they should have been able to fly. His after-action report suggesting these fighters must have refueled at secret Swedish bases was dismissed by Berlin as combat fatigue affecting judgment. Similar sightings multiplied. Hanover on January 29th, Magdeburg on February 3rd. Each pushing the known envelope of American fighter range further east, each met with official denial. The Reich Air Ministry issued a directive on February 15th stating categorically that reports of American single-engine fighters beyond the Ruhr were misidentifications. Pilots making such claims would be subject to medical evaluation. The truth was far more disturbing than Swedish conspiracies or pilot hallucinations. At Wright Field in Ohio, American engineers had achieved what German technical experts declared physically impossible, extending the P-51 Mustang's combat radius to over 650 miles using expendable auxiliary fuel tanks. The secret lay in two revolutionary innovations. The Packard built Merlin engine and British-designed paper drop tanks. The Packard V1653 engine was not merely a licensed copy of the Rolls-Royce Merlin but an improved version manufactured to tolerances exceeding even British specifications. Using American mass production techniques refined in Detroit's automotive plants, Packard had created an engine producing 490 horsepower at sea level while maintaining over 200 horsepower at 30,000 feet through its two-stage, 2-speed supercharger. The drop tanks represented elegant simplicity. Constructed from pressed paper impregnated with plastic resin, these 108-gallon auxiliary tanks weighed just 35 pounds empty, lighter than ammunition for one of the Mustang's machine guns. British engineers had developed the laminated kraft paper construction method, which could hold fuel for approximately 5 hours before beginning to break down, more than sufficient for the 2.5-hour flight to Berlin. German engineers had experimented with auxiliary tanks, but their approach reflected fundamental philosophical differences. German tanks were metal, reusable, expensive, and heavy, the degrading performance so severely that fighters carrying them became vulnerable to attack. American paper tanks were cheap, disposable, and light. A P-51 with two 108-gallon drop tanks could fly to Berlin, jettison the tanks in seconds when entering combat, and fight with full performance. To understand March 6's psychological impact, one must first grasp the trauma of October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, when the 8th Air Force attempted to bomb Schweinfurt's Ball, bearing factories without long-range fighter escort. Of 2091 B-17 flying fortresses crossing German airspace, 60 were shot down and 138 damaged, a loss rate of 20.6% with over 600 airmen casualties. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated with brutal efficiency that unescorted daylight bombing was unsustainable. General Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, declared October 14 the greatest victory of the Jagdwaffe in defensive warfare. In his post-war memoir he wrote, "After Schweinfurt, we believed we had proven that daylight precision bombing was a failed concept. The Americans would have to join the British in night bombing, where accuracy was impossible and damage limited. We had won the theoretical battle. But Galland had made a crucial miscalculation, assuming Americans would accept existing technology's limitations rather than developing new solutions. When reports of a new American fighter with extraordinary range reached his desk in December 1943, he dismissed them. When his own pilots reported single-engine fighters over Hanover in January 1944, he accused them of hallucinations. The morning of March 6, 1944, dawned clear and cold across northern Europe. Perfect flying weather. At RAF Leiston in England, ground crews had worked through the night preparing the 357th Fighter Group for the most ambitious mission yet attempted, the first P-51 unit to provide escort all the way to Berlin. Colonel Henry Spicer briefed his pilots at 0600 hours. "Gentlemen, today we go to Big B the entire distance. We'll be over enemy territory for 4 hours. Any man who doesn't think his aircraft is in perfect condition should abort now. There will be no second chances at these distances." No one aborted. At 08:30, 730 heavy bombers began lifting off from bases across East Anglia. Behind them, 796 fighters prepared to provide relay escort, P-47s for initial penetration, P-38s for the middle phase, and P-51 Mustangs for the deepest penetration and target escort. The 357th Fighter Group launched 48 P-51Bs, though only 33 would successfully reach Berlin after mechanical issues and navigation challenges in heavy cloud cover. In Germany, Reich air defense radar stations began tracking the massive formation as it assembled over the North Sea. Plotters at Die Beritz, the primary fighter control center for Berlin's defense, initially assessed this as another feint. Americans had approached Berlin before, but always turned away to hit targets in western Germany. Oberst Hannes Trotloff, commanding the 2nd Fighter Division responsible for Berlin's defense, studied the plot and made a fateful decision. He would hold his fighters on the ground until bombers committed to their target. No point wasting fuel if this was another deception. At 11:30 hours, lead bombers crossed into German airspace near Arnhem. Escorting P-47s engaged German fighters rising from bases in Holland and western Germany. Everything proceeded according to established pattern. Luftwaffe pilots engaged cautiously, waiting for the moment when American escorts reached fuel limits and turned back. At 12:55 hours, as the bomber stream approached Berlin, Major Hans Kogler led his mixed formation to intercept what they believed would be unescorted bombers. His force consisted of 7 Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighters pressed into day service along with 41 single-engine Bf-109s. German controllers had tracked P-47s turning back, and assumed bombers were now vulnerable. Major Thomas Hayes, leading the 357th Fighter Group's 33 Mustangs that had reached Berlin through difficult weather, later described the moment. "We broke through the cloud layer to see B-24 Liberators below and to our left. Simultaneously, we spotted approximately 40 enemy aircraft positioning for attack. Me-110s and Me-109s, they hadn't seen us yet. We had altitude advantage and complete surprise. The German formation, focused entirely on the bomber stream, never saw the Mustangs until too late. Hayes dove on enemy fighters calling out, 'Greenhouse Squadron, this is Greenhouse Leader.' Bandits at 2 o'clock low, drop tanks and attack. Feldwebel Jan Myler of JG-11, flying one of the escorting Bf-109s, survived the encounter. We were in perfect position. Just beginning our attack dive on the bombers when tracers flashed past my canopy. I looked up to see single-engine fighters with American markings diving on us from above. It was impossible. We were over Berlin. My first thought was that these must be captured aircraft, some kind of deception. But then I saw the drop tanks falling away, dozens of them, and I knew these were real American fighters with range we hadn't imagined possible. What followed was not a battle but an execution. German fighters, caught completely by surprise and out of position, scattered in confusion. In 12 minutes of combat, the 357th Fighter Group claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single P-51. At his estate at Karinghall, 50 miles north of Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was having lunch when the call came from General Adolf Galland. American fighters were over Berlin. Single-engine fighters. "You're mistaken, Galland," Göring said flatly. "Check your reports again." "Herr Reichsmarschall, I have visual confirmation from multiple sources. P-51 Mustangs are engaging our fighters over Potsdam at this moment." Göring's rage was volcanic. According to his aide present at the scene, the Reichsmarschall threw his wine glass against the wall and screamed, "This is treason! Sabotage!" The pilots are lying to cover their cowardice. I will have every man who makes such claims court-martialed. Even as Göring raged, evidence was undeniable. From his own estate, he could see contrails over Berlin, hear distant thunder of aircraft engines at full power. His aide later testified that Göring stood at the window for nearly an hour, watching the sky, saying nothing. That evening, Göring issued his most infamous order of the air war. Any pilot who claims to have seen American single-engine fighters over Berlin is to be arrested for cowardice and spreading defeatist propaganda. The maximum range of American fighters is the rear. This is a scientific fact. The order created chaos in fighter units already reeling from losses. Pilots who had just survived combat against P-51s were now threatened with court-martial for reporting what they had seen. Several squadron commanders simply ignored the order, telling their pilots to report twin-engine fighters in combat reports. At a heated Air Ministry conference on March 8, General Galland presented Göring with a piece of a P-51's drop tank, clearly stamped, made in USA, and recovered from a field near Magdeburg. Göring's response entered Luftwaffe legend. "I don't care if you bring me a whole Mustang on a silver platter. The Americans cannot escort to Berlin. It's scientifically impossible." At this point, according to Galland's memoirs, he knew Germany had lost the war. Later at Nuremberg, Göring would admit, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." For individual Luftwaffe pilots, Mustang's appearance over Berlin represented not just tactical surprise, but existential crisis. These were men repeatedly told they were defending an impregnable fortress, that German science and engineering were superior to anything the Allies could produce. Hauptmann Heinz Nock, commanding 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary on March 7, 1944, "Yesterday changed everything. We had always known where we were safe, where we could reform, where we could attack without interference. That certainty is gone. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. We are no longer hunters, but the hunted, even over our own capital." The psychological impact was amplified by the opposition's quality. The P-51B was not merely present over Berlin, it was dominant. Its Merlin engine gave it a top speed of 437 miles at 25,000 feet, faster than the Bf-109 G6 386 MF at the same altitude. Its laminar flow wing provided exceptional high-altitude handling. Its 50-caliber machine guns delivered concentrated firepower, and most crucially, its pilots were fresh, not fatigued from hours of combat at fuel reserve's edge. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin coincided with and accelerated another crisis slowly strangling the Luftwaffe: fuel shortage. Germany had always depended on synthetic fuel production, converting coal to aviation gasoline through the Burgess hydrogenation process. This required massive industrial plants vulnerable to precision bombing. Before March 1944, these synthetic fuel plants had been largely immune from attack, too far from England for accurate bombing with fighter escort. The mathematics was simple. Without escort, bombers couldn't survive over targets long enough for precision bombing. Without precision, massive concrete hydrogenation plant structures were unlikely to be seriously damaged. The Mustang changed this equation overnight. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first major attack against the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. 800 bombers escorted by 75 fighters, including 298 P-51s, delivered 718 tons of bombs with unprecedented accuracy. Production at Luna dropped 90% overnight. By June 1944, German aviation fuel production had fallen from 175 tons per month to 35,000 tons. By September, it was down to 7,000 tons, barely enough to fuel 500 sorties per day across all fronts. Training flights were cancelled entirely. New pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 50 hours total flight time, compared to the 250 hours standard in 1942. The true measure of the Mustang's impact became clear on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in history required absolute air superiority over the beaches. The Allies flew 14 6 and 74 sorties on D-Day. The Luftwaffe managed 319, losing 35 aircraft in the process. Over the actual invasion beaches, only 2 German fighters appeared throughout the entire day. In desperation, the Luftwaffe developed increasingly suicidal tactics. The Sturmgruppe assault group concept epitomized this desperation. FW-1WAAs were modified with additional armor plating, 30 mm cannons, and reinforced windscreens. These flying tanks would bore straight through fighter screens to attack bombers at point-blank range. The tactics that worked briefly in July became increasingly suicidal as American fighter strength grew. Each mission became Russian roulette with all chambers loaded. Germany's last hope lay in revolutionary technology, the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwabe, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of 540 mph, it was 100 mph faster than the P-51D. In experienced pilots' hands, it could have changed the air war, but the Me-262 arrived too late and in too few numbers. More critically, Hitler's insistence that it be used as a blitz bomber rather than fighter interceptor wasted precious months. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was experiencing what historians would later call the death of the expert. Veteran pilots who had scored dozens or hundreds of victories were being killed faster than they'd be replaced. The appearance of Mustangs deep inside Germany meant there was no safe space to train replacements, no quiet sector where novices could gain experience. The statistics tell a grim story. In 1940, new Luftwaffe pilots received 250 hours of flight training before combat. By 1944, this had been reduced to 80 hours. By early 1945, some pilots were sent into combat with as little as 20 hours in type. Meanwhile, American pilots arriving in England had 400 to 500 hours of flight time, including 100 hours in type and extensive gunnery training. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. 900 fighters, virtually the entire remaining strength of the Luftwaffe in the West, took off at dawn. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise, destroying 305 Allied aircraft on the ground and damaging 190, but the cost was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and, more critically, 213 pilots, including many irreplaceable experienced leaders. The American response was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, Mustang sweeps were methodically hunting down weakened German fighter units. In the week following Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe lost another 400 aircraft, mostly destroyed on the ground. As 1945 progressed, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective force. Individual pilots still flew individual sorties, but coordinated operations were impossible. The appearance of Mustangs over any German airfield meant likely destruction. After the war, surviving Luftwaffe pilots were remarkably candid about the P-51 Mustang's impact. Adolf Galland stated in a 1954 interview, "The P-51 Mustang was the decisive weapon in the air war over Germany. Once it appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. It was like a chess game where your opponent suddenly has queens that can move anywhere on the board." Johannes Steinhoff, who survived terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later served as Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force. His assessment was equally stark. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed the very concept of German air superiority. We had built our entire defensive strategy on the assumption that Germany proper was beyond single-engine fighters' range. When that assumption proved false, everything collapsed. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented more than tactical victory. It was a strategic revolution in air warfare. For the first time in history, one nation could project decisive air power over another major power's entire territory. The implications extended far beyond World War II. Establishing principles shaped post-war military thinking and demonstrating that air superiority meant controlling airspace, not just over battlefields, but over entire nations. The P-51's success validated the entire American strategic bombing concept, making precision daylight bombing possible through long-range escort. While the British continued area bombing at night, Americans could now put bombs precisely on specific facilities with devastating accuracy. When dawn broke on May 8, 1945, WWII, American Mustangs patrolled the skies over defeated Germany with no opposition. The Luftwaffe that had once terrorized Europe no longer existed. Its aircraft were destroyed or grounded for lack of fuel, its pilots dead, wounded, or prisoners, its infrastructure rubble. The transformation from March 6, 1944, to May 8, 1945, just 14 months, represents one of the most complete military victories in history. The P-51 Mustang had been the instrument of that victory, turning Allied air power from a costly liability into an irresistible force. In those 14 months, Mustang pilots flew over 213,000 sorties, claimed 4,950 aerial victories, destroyed 431 aircraft on the ground, and dropped 31,000 tons of bombs. Behind these statistics was human reality: young American men, average age 22, flying aluminum aircraft powered by Packard, built Merlin engines, had comprehensively destroyed one of history's most formidable air forces through superior technology, training tactics, and industrial support. When Major Hans Kogler saw those first Mustangs over Brandenburg on March 6, 1944, he witnessed more than enemy fighters. He witnessed the future of air warfare. The P-51 Mustang had proven that technology could overcome distance, that industrial capacity could triumph over individual skill, that methodical approach could defeat improvised brilliance. The shocked German pilots encountering Mustangs over Berlin were not just facing a superior aircraft, they were facing the combined industrial, technological, and organizational power of the United States projected across an ocean and deep into their homeland's heart. It was a demonstration of force that shattered every assumption about what was possible in aerial warfare, marking the moment when air power became truly strategic and when American industrial democracy proved it could outproduce, out-innovate, and outfight Nazi totalitarianism.